On today's episode of the Locked On Mariners podcast, our report card series wraps up with a look at the Mariners bullpen, coaching staff, and front office. Colby, hit it.
You are Locked On Mariners, your daily Seattle Mariners podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Ahoy, sailors. It is Tuesday, October 24th, 2023. This is Trident and Colby Zato for the Locked On Mariners podcast, brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Last minute tickets, the lowest price guaranteed. Thank you so much for making us your first listen. Subscribe, like, and turn on alerts if you're watching on YouTube, or subscribe and leave a 5-star review on your preferred podcast platform if you like what you hear. And if you're part of the crew and rock with us every single day, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if you want to hear from us even more, please consider signing up for our Patreon. You can now get a free 7-day trial to check out the show. The link, as well as our social accounts, is in the description of this episode. On the show today, we're going to hand out our final grades to the 2023 Mariners. We'll be looking at the bullpen, the coaching staff, and the front office. But we're going to start with the bullpen here, Colby. As a unit, the Mariners bullpen ranked this year 4th in ERA, 4th in FIP, 1st in XFIP, 6th in FWAR, 2nd in strikeouts per 9 innings pitched, 9th in walks per 9 innings pitched, 9th in win probability added. They allowed the 7th lowest hard hit rate as a unit and the 4th lowest barrel percentage as a unit, all while throwing the 3rd fewest innings of any bullpen in the league. And Colby, we'll get into some of the specific names here, like Matt Brash and Andres Munoz. But as a whole, how did you feel about this bullpen in 2023?
A little tough to say. There's kind of two versions of the bullpen too. You have the pre-Seawald trade and post-Seawald trade bullpen.
Yeah.
And not surprisingly, the bullpen after Seawald was traded was a little shallow. They still did a pretty good job of picking up the slack there, but
they did their best.
Sure. I mean, they were awful for the first couple weeks of September, and then they kind of figured it out a little bit in the middle, and then a couple bad outings at the end there. But a lot of blame to go around for how the end of the year went. But the bullpen overall was good. It was a good bullpen, certainly. I don't think it was a great bullpen. I don't think it was an elite bullpen, particularly at the end of the year. They were just missing some probability in the high leverage spots. Brash had a few struggles here and there. Munoz really struggled pretty much for the entirety of the post Seawald trade, which, not that surprising considering he missed a chunk of time, and he'd look like he had taken a step back anyways, but we're going to rehash that trade later, it appears. Yeah. So no reason to get too deep into it, but other than that, you had some guys step up, have really good years, some holdovers have really good years, and you had, as is basically now just expected, you had a couple of guys come out of nowhere and just have really solid seasons, career years. So the bullpen as a whole, it wasn't a huge problem for most of the year. Was a little short. That's not really their fault. So I think, when I look at it, and it was a top 10 bullpen, I think it was closer to 10 than it was to 1. So I think, it's a B plus, somewhere in that range. It was good. It was solid. They needed help. They didn't get it, unfortunately, but based on what they did have and how they managed the entire season, they do get a B plus. And I'll knock them down a little bit, just because they didn't have to cover a ton of innings this year, which is a credit to the Mariners starting staff.
Yeah, I'll go A minus here for the Mariners bullpen, especially because they were able to survive some of the guys that were supposed to be a big part of this thing not really panning out. Diego Castillo didn't pan out. Matt Festa didn't pan out. Penn Murphy got hurt pretty early on. Prolander Berroa wasn't a factor at all, like we were expecting him to be. Probably should have been, so yeah. And they were still able to get really strong contributions out of guys that you didn't really expect, like Justin Topa and Gabe Spire and Taylor Saucedo. So from that point of view, I think it was a roaring success for the Mariners bullpen this year. But yeah, it was obviously an arm short once they traded Seawald, and there wasn't really a guy in that unit after that point that I fully trusted, because even with Brash and Munoz, with how good those guys are, there's some command control issues there as well that makes every single outing with them a little shaky, where I don't feel fully confident in their ability to shut things down. But obviously, year across the board for the most part for both of those guys, and a really good year for guys like Topa, Inspire, and Saucedo. That was really your top 5. And then Isaiah Campbell was pretty good, especially later on in the year. He had some really, really strong outings, like the one in Tampa.
He might have been your best reliever in September.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of positives to take away from this bullpen overall. And now, of course, most of that stuff probably won't carry over to 2024. We know how fickle bullpens are. But as far as 2023 goes, I think I think it was overall a pretty successful year. And I think the unit as a whole did the best that it possibly could have, despite having arguably its most trustworthy piece traded at the deadline. So specifically though, talking about Brash and Munoz here at the top, how did you feel about their respective seasons?
Yeah, for me, Brash gets an A. Still some things to clean up. There were times, particularly early in the year, where he would just come out of the bullpen and he would throw 2 pitches and you would know like he's not throwing strikes today. And he just never really was able to make that adjustment. And then he had a couple more outings where he just had bad BABIP, right? He'd strike out the first 2 guys in a high leverage spot, and then there's a single through the hole in between second base and first base, and now 2 runs score, and it just looks worse than it is. But overall, Brash definitely took a step forward. He was durable. 78 games pitched. I think he led the American League in games pitched this year. 100 strikeouts. The walk rate went down again. It's still a little high. Like overall, if that's who Brash is, you'll take it. Like that's a really good reliever. That's a high leverage guy. But you'd like that number closer to 3. I think it was in the 3.7s this year. But again, that's fine as long as he maintains his swing and miss stuff. And yeah, Brash's stuff's still pretty good. So found some consistency with a 2-seam fastball as well. So another weapon for Brash to use to go along with the curveball and the slider. And of course, the 4-seamer, we saw the velocity jump up a little bit on both the 2-seam and the 4-seam. Both of those pitches can touch 100 miles an hour. So Brash, I feel really good about entering next year. He's not Mariano Rivera, right? You're not going to put all-star next to his name every single year and all that, but he's a good reliever. You have to feel pretty good about where he's at entering next year. Munoz, C+, B-. He really lost his slider down the stretch, and it was a disaster. Munoz needs that slider. We know that he can throw really hard. We all know that. But remember last year when he struggled early, it was because of the over-reliance on the fastball, and the Mariners finally got him to start throwing that slider more as his primary, and that's when it clicked. So we know how important that slider is for Andres. He's got a whole offseason to get it figured out. He did deal with some hip issues, and I think a shoulder issue. Was that what put him on the IL? I can't recall. I think it was a shoulder, but we do know that he had a hip issue. He had a hip issue, he had surgery. So maybe that's part of it. We'll see how he figures it out. But overall he was fine, but he really struggled for long stretches of the second half. And that is going to lower your grade pretty significantly, particularly if you're a high leverage guy like Munoz is, who basically became the closer after Sewald left. So C+, B-. Like he was good for the most part. The numbers are good, but again, don't box score scout, guys.
Yeah, I'll go C+ on Munoz. It was a shoulder issue, by the way, just to confirm that. And obviously, that has to factor in here with our grade, because that's obviously not his fault, and that probably had a longer lasting impact on his season than maybe we know, for us on the outside looking in. But yeah, he really needs that slider, and he just completely lost it. Now, to counteract that a little bit, he was able to throw that 2-seamer a lot more, and that pitch was very effective for him at times, and that was a nasty looking pitch at times. And he was also able to increase his velocity like later on in the season. Like he was able to suddenly just tap into more velo, like consistent 100+ mile per hour velo towards the end of the year after the hip issue propped up, which was strange, but we'll take it. I'm not overall concerned about Andres. He really needs to find that slider though over the course of the offseason before 2024 begins here for him to be the best version of Andres Munoz. As for Brash, I think he was great this year, but I think valuing him as the fourth best reliever in baseball might be a little strong. Fangraphs really love strikeouts, and he struck out a lot of guys, and that's why he was worth 2.1 F4 this year. He was one of just 4 relievers in baseball this year to post a 2+ F4. He was the 4th most valuable pitcher on the Mariners roster in general this year by that standard. But he had some walk issues, like you mentioned. He has some inconsistency woes with finding the strike zone, and you kind of know which version of Matt Brash you're going to get on a night-to-night basis from the first couple of pitches he throws. Anyway, we're going to talk about the Mariners coaching staff, hand out some grades to them in just a moment. But first, a reminder, this episode of the Locked On Mariners podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. October baseball is back, folks, and you can make your postseason debut with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Join FanDuel today, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon, that's LOCKDON, to create your new account, and you can get in on the action from the first pitch until the final out. Bet on everything from strikeouts to home runs to who will win the game. And if you don't want to wait the whole game to get a win, predict what will happen in the next at bat with quick bets. So head on over to FanDuel.com/lockedon right now. Step up to the plate this postseason with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And you're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Thank you again for making us your first listen here as we hand out some grades to the Mariners bullpen, the Mariners coaching staff, and the Mariners front office. We just did the bullpen. We're going to be doing the coaching staff here in just a moment. But first, Colby, you're giving away some stuff. What are you giving away?
Well, apparently nothing if you guys don't get off your butts and start subscribing to the YouTube channel. But you have the opportunity to win some really cool cards here, like this guy we just talked about, autograph Matt Brash card. There's also this Brian Wu card, autograph card. Bryce Miller. These are some heavy hitters, guys. These are some heavy hitters. And of course, probably the grand prize here is this Harry Ford autograph card, which I'm feeling really confident I'm going to be able to keep. And I will laugh at you guys when you let me keep it. So
there you go. There you go. So all you have to do is subscribe to this YouTube channel. If you're not watching us on YouTube, if you're listening on a podcast platform, head on over to youtube.com, type in Locked On Mariners into the search bar, hit subscribe, and leave a comment on any of our videos between last Tuesday and October 30th. You're automatically entered into this giveaway. So in order for us to give away each of these cards, we have to hit some subscriber goals on YouTube. We're getting closer. We're inching closer, but you guys need to really do your part here. At 9,500 subscribers, we'll be giving away the Matt Brash card. At 9,750 subscribers, we'll be giving away the Bryce Miller card. At 10,000 subscribers, we'll be giving away the Brian Wu card. And at 10,250 subscribers, we'll be giving away the Harry Ford card. So if you want those, you got to subscribe, yo. And you got to tell your friends and enemies and your dog and your cat and all those, everyone that you know, to come and subscribe to the Locked On Mariners YouTube channel so we can give away these cards. All right. Colby, the Mariners coaching staff. How did you feel about them? Specifically, how did you feel about Scott Service this year?
B plus.
Really?
I don't know.
Really?
Like, I don't like what do you want me like? Did he bunt a few too many times? Yes. Did he leave his starter in too long a few times? Yes. Did he also have to manage a what from the sounds of it was an incredibly upset clubhouse for the entire year because they didn't feel like the front office believed in them? Yes. Like, so those are all things that kind of happened. Did he have to deal with a George Kirby issue in Tampa? Yeah. Did he handle that one well? Yeah, I think so. Did he handle the Cal Raleigh one well? Not really, but then again,
No.
like, are we sure that was Scott's decision, or did that come from Scott's boss? So it's so tough.
I mean,
to know.
Scott still could have expressed himself a little bit better there without putting himself in an awkward position with ownership. But yeah.
But yeah, the simple fact is that we don't have a good idea of how well of a job Scott did, because we don't have anywhere near enough of the information about what he had to deal with this year. Now, again, it does sound like the Mariners players were pretty upset with the offseason, that we know that they were really upset with the trade deadline. And so kind of managing that that aspect of it is tough, because, Scott is technically management, but he's also the guy who has the most, interaction with the players out of that management team. So it's a little tough, and I know a lot of people like, oh well, it's just tough because, like, the players ultimately are in charge of the players. I know the manager is like the babysitter and all that stuff, but the players have to, kind of control the clubhouse and all that stuff. So it's really tough to say what Scott does. Um, you know, I think that, I think he's just the same guy. I don't think he's getting better. And that's fine, because I think, when he talks to the media and the way he creates culture and builds culture, he's still really good at that for the most
Mm,
part. He's not perfect, but he's still really good at that
sure. No
overall.
one is. No one is.
No. And then in the in-game management stuff, I think he's kind of average. I think he's kind of, he's
Right.
okay. Yes, there were some horrific bunt calls. We could go over all of them, and I probably remember every single one in the situation, because they're bad. Scott doesn't decide to bunt a lot, but when he does, it's usually pretty stupid.
Mm,
Like asking your best hitter to bunt against the Blue Jays. Dumb.
right.
But I don't think he's a great improv guy. Like, if the plan doesn't go exactly how he planned it out, I don't think he's great at thinking on his feet. So overall, I think Scott is good. I think he's a good manager, and that's really all. It's just tough for me to be like, oh well, last year he made the playoffs, so it's an A. This year he didn't, so it's a C. Like,
Right.
results aren't manager controlled results aren't as black and white as some people think. Like, it's hard to say, because again, we don't know.
We're not
Haven't
there. We're not in
Right,
the clubhouse. We don't know what the
right.
actual dynamic is. Yeah.
Right. Plus, I mean, this year Scott had to deal with some starting pitching injuries that he didn't last year. He had to
Yeah.
control, kind of manage a young staff, and a lot of the decisions that are made, by the way, that seem to be like those are Scott's service decisions. They're not a lot of the times. They're a collaborative effort. So it's tough, man. It's really tough to grade Scott. Every year, it's tough to grade Scott,
Yeah.
because the only stuff we really get to see and he'll take credit or blame for is the in-game stuff, and he's average at that at best. And we know that he has a lot more value than what he, when he decides to bunt and when he doesn't. Like, there's a lot more value to Scott's service in that, and his coaching staff. So, I don't know. I don't feel good about grading Scott, because I feel like I only get to see like 10% of his paper that he turned in, and I have to guess what the rest of it is.
Right. I don't want to grade him for the things that I think I know,
Right.
and and rather just grade him for the things that I've actually seen with my own eyes, and that's mostly in-game management. And this year I thought this was a little bit of a regressive year for him. But also I feel like some of these things, like, having Gino and Teo play all those games, and some of the weird pitching decisions and all that, is more reflective of the circumstances of the roster build, and
Mhm.
that's not really his fault. Like, I think he's just kind of doing the best with what was given to him, which wasn't a lot. And I think this is one of the few years over Scott's tenure where he hasn't really been supported very well by Jerry, who's supposed to be his partner in crime. Right.
Mhm.
So that to me, like, it I'm gonna give him like a C plus. I'm just gonna like sit fairly like middle of the road here.
Ty sitting here telling people to fire Scott Service.
Right.
Wow.
I'm gonna
Wow.
sit fairly middle of the road here, because again, we don't know exactly what's actually Scott's fault and what's Jerry's fault and what's other coaches' fault and what's the players' fault.
It's the hitting
After
coach
the season,
discussion all over.
right? After the season was over, I said, everyone's to blame. It's not just one particular party here. The players were at fault
Sure.
for a lot of the issues down the stretch. Coaching staff, I'm sure, were at fault to a certain degree. Front office was obviously at fault. Ownership obviously at fault for some of this. Like, everyone deserves blame. But as far as Scott goes, you made a great point in that he had to handle a very difficult situation with a lot of upset people within that clubhouse. Paul Sewald went on the Chris Rose's show the other day and talked about how the clubhouse was upset about the offseason, how the offseason went, and they felt that they needed another, bat or two heading into the season, like we all thought, right? Like the players feel pretty much the exact same way that the fans and us doing this podcast feel or felt going into the season.
They care more than we do. Just
Right.
to put that out there. Like,
yeah,
if you think you care more about, the outcome of a baseball game than Julio Rodriguez, you're nuts.
Right. So
just
like,
throw that out there.
Scott had to handle that. And I'm sure a lot of fingers were pointed at Scott within that clubhouse because he's the mediator between the clubhouse and the front office, right? So the way that he was able to balance that and and still help lead them, obviously the players are the ones that ultimately did this, but he helped spearhead them to being right on the doorstep to win a division still after all of that. I think he should be applauded for that. But again, I feel like some of the in-game decisions, the stuff that we can actually see, the stuff that we can actually judge him on, I think he had a little bit of a regressive year on that front. So again, because there's so much context that we're just not aware of, I'll just sit middle of the road here and go C+. I know that's a really boring answer, but that's my answer. Sorry.
Coward.
Right.
Yeah. Not to, hurry you along here, but can we get to the front office? Because I have some things to say about that. And I will be tying in the ownership group to this grade as well. So
yeah, that's the headline here. That's the headline matchup here is the front office grade. So let's get into that in just a moment. But first, a reminder: this episode of the Locked On Mariners podcast is brought to you by Gametime. Buying tickets to your favorite events shouldn't be stressful. Gametime is a fast and easy way to buy tickets for all the sports, music, comedy, and theater near you. And with killer deals on last-minute tickets and their best price guarantee, you can stop stressing over the tickets and start getting hyped for the fun you'll have. So forget planning months in advance. Gametime has deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. Snag the tickets without the stress with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. And you're listening to the Locked On Mariners podcast. Thank you again for making us your first listen. So we are now at the main event of this show. The last grades we'll be handing out to the 2023 Mariners. And that's for Jerry Dipoto, Justin Hollander, the Mariners front office, and John Stanton in the Mariners ownership. So, Colby, I think I have a feeling which direction you're going here, but tell us what grade you're giving for everyone involved.
Are we throwing the ownership in with the same grade, or do they get a separate grade?
Separate grade.
Okay, so front office staff, I'll give them a D plus C minus because, and this is weighed pretty heavily, I do feel like they knocked the draft out of the park, and that does count.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
So, they had 3 first-round picks and essentially 3 first-round picks, and they nailed it. Emerson is already getting buzz as the best prospect in the Mariner system, in a good Mariner system. Obviously, how much we like Ty Pete, and Farmelo is certainly a high upside play there, and just the rest of the draft in general. Looks like they had another really good draft. Now, we don't know that they've had a really good draft yet since they took Kirby, really. But, just based on the early returns of the last 2 or 3 draft classes, sure feels like they figured some stuff out there. So the draft does count. I don't want to be too harsh on them in terms of the Colton Wong acquisition that didn't work, or the AJ Pollock acquisition that didn't work, because those made sense. Those were moves that made a ton of sense, and they just didn't work. Teoscar, he was okay. He wasn't a disaster, but he wasn't what you needed him to be. And then obviously the deadline. The deadline is the big one here after the fact. And the Sewald trade, fine, totally good trade. But the fact that they didn't do anything after, and we know they had an opportunity. I can't blame ownership for Jerry and Justin's inactivity at the deadline. That's purely on them. So, I think, when you can kind of put that all together, they did, they did do things like draft and develop Wu and Miller, who were huge this year, and didn't trade them this winter too, which is a thing. They did, show some faith in Jared Kelenic, and for the most part that worked out until the self-sabotage. They did make some decisions that actually worked, and the decisions they made were mostly like what they didn't trade. Like they didn't try and force a Bryce Miller trade because they wanted the big bad, and now Bryce Miller is worth significantly more than he was last winter. So discipline wise, they were fine. They were fine in the draft. I like the draft they had. I even don't mind the Seawall trade, in a vacuum, but they were still a bat short in the offseason, at least one. They were still a bat short and a bullpen arm short at the deadline. Those are things that everybody in the world knew, and
Yep.
they didn't address. So I can't give
Yep.
them more than like a C minus. Like it was a very, even giving them the benefit of the doubt on Wong and Pollock, which is totally fine because nobody thought they were going to be that bad. Nobody. Even all of that, giving them the benefit of the doubt on that, they came up short again for the third straight acquisition period. So yeah, it's a C minus, and particularly the deadline here is the big bugaboo here. So yeah, D plus C minus, like that's really all I feel like giving them, and I think a large portion of that is actually lifted up by the fact that I really like their draft class this year.
Yeah, I love the draft class, but I'm gonna give them a D because this roster going into 2023 was not as good as it needed to be. And look, I don't want to hyper focus on Tommy La Stella and Cooper Hummel, but the fact that you went into this season saying we want to win the World Series and we want to win a division and all that stuff, and then tried to sell us on Tommy La Stella and Cooper Hummel being a piece of that, right? Being part of your 26-man roster at the start of the year, you're unserious. You're being unserious with that.
I mean, more specifically, they tried to sell us on that because they whiffed, because
Right.
they misread the market. That's
Right.
why you ended up in that situation, and that's why it's
Right.
so bad.
Because we know that they went after guys like Brandon Belt. They just came up empty-handed. If Brandon Belt was your DH this year instead of Tommy La Stella to start the year, we might be having a very different conversation right now.
We might be celebrating the first Mariners World Series appearance right now.
Like that's how close they were, and that's what makes this ultimately even more frustrating in retrospect. They knocked it out of the park again with some of the reliever finds. So that's great. And again, that helped them survive, Diego Castillo not panning out, Penn Murphy getting hurt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Look, again, like you said, I'm not going to fully blame them on the Wong and Pollock stuff, because the process of those moves, the process behind those moves, and I know most people that are listening to the show don't want to hear this, but process is very important here. The process behind those moves made a ton of sense. And there was no one in the right mind. All of you are liars if you said that you thought, or if you're saying that you thought that Colton Wong would be literally 100% worse than he was last year, coming off of a career year offensively. If you thought that AJ Pollock was going to be like literally 120 or 130% worse than he was against lefties from 2022 to 2023, you're out of your mind. If you said that you knew that. Like, all right, if you thought that Colton Wong was going to be a lateral move from Adam Frazier, fine. There really was no evidence going into the season that said that was going to be the case, but we would have taken that.
If he was, you probably win the division.
Probably. You probably win it.
You probably win the division.
You probably win an additional game or two over the course of the first half of the season. So, which would have made a significant difference in the end. So yeah, from that perspective, like I don't necessarily blame them for that, but the results do matter. The results of what happened do matter, and the fact that Teo wasn't the Robin to Julio's Batman like he was supposed to be, that does matter. And the fact that they built this roster or this lineup, made up of guys that are strikeout heavy, or quite a few guys that are strikeout heavy, like that does matter, because that wound up being a huge problem for them this season. It was just a bad roster build, right? Or at least a mediocre roster build, given what the opportunity was, and given the chances that they had to go out and get significantly better. The deadline, though, was a complete utter disaster. Again, the Paul Sewald deal is fine in a vacuum. That's great value for a year and a half of a top 15, top 20-ish reliever in baseball. That's great. Like they knocked that deal out of the park, frankly. But because they didn't follow that up with another acquisition of a reliever to help supplement Sewald like they did when they traded Kendall Graveman and went out and got Diego Castillo, that negatively impacted the Mariners bullpen and the Mariners chances of going to the playoffs over those final 2 months, and specifically September. We saw that play out right before our eyes, the negative impacts that the Paul Sewald deal, or rather subtracting Paul Sewald from the equation, had on this team. Also not going out and getting another proven bat like a Tommy Pham, Mark Canha, etc. There is no way that you can convince me that they didn't have an opportunity to land one of those guys for something that wouldn't kill them. No way. Absolutely no way. I know beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and maybe the Brewers the Mets, liked what the Brewers and the Diamondbacks were offering more than whatever the Mariners might have been able to offer.
You could
But
still beat it.
They could still beat it. They could still beat it. They could still beat it at the end of the day.
course they
So
could.
they didn't do enough at the deadline. And then I'm also going to factor in the end of the year press conference into this thing as well.
Sure.
That
That's
was a disaster. That was an F minus 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 minus. You guys know how we feel about that end of year presser. So I'm gonna give them a D.
I don't know if we want to try and cram the ownership grade into this. Maybe we carry that over to tomorrow's episode, because I've got a full 7 minutes that I could like a whole segment that I could rant about ownership.
All right, there we go. We're calling an audible. We're actually wrapping up the grades tomorrow with ownership. John Stanton, you are in our crosshairs. Yeah.
Ty, just sit down and shut up and let me go.
Right. Thank you for keeping that clean. Appreciate it. All right. So is that going to do it for our show then?
For tomorrow.
Right. Is that going to do it for our show then?
I think so.
All right. Real quick, question of the day. Folks, in what order do you put on your socks and shoes? Don't be a sicko about this.
If it's anything other than sock, shoe, you're a psychopath and you need help.
Do you go sock, shoe, or are you a weirdo that goes sock, shoe, or some other sicko order? Maybe you're one of those people that just goes shoe, no socks. Maybe you're one of those sickos. Let us know down below. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Locked On Mariners podcast. For Colby Patnode, I'm Trident Gonzalez. Be sure to give us a follow on Twitter at @LO_Mariners. You can follow me at Dane Gonzalez, that's DANEGNZLZ, and Colby at CPAT11, that's CPAT11. You can also find all that stuff in the description of this episode. And thank you again for making us your first listen. Have yourself a beautiful baseball day, and we'll see you next time. Peace.